Good evening, my friends. It's very nice to have you with us for the fourth of 5 classes about the chakras in daily life. I'm making that distinction because that's really how I've approached this. It hasn't really been a meditative or experiential. It's been more conceptual about how we can understand the chakras and use them. And this class, and especially the last class, really sort of, I hope, knit all that together. So before we have a little chanting from Keshava, let me start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Guide us in our understanding, that we may draw deeply into ourselves an awareness of the power of the chakras within us, and how to use that power for the only purpose for which we were born, which is to draw close to God. Guide our steps, our thoughts, our actions, our feelings, that in every way we work in harmony with divine will and become more and more transparent channels of thy infinite light. Om. Peace. Amen. So we'll have a couple of chants, a few minutes of meditation, and then we'll start. Well, we are starting. Then we'll start the other part.
but an empty vessel. empty vessel, empty vessel, I am but an empty vessel, filled with the presence of God, oh, filled with the presence of God. I am love, I am joy, I am peace. I am love, I am joy, I am peace. I am love, I am joy, I am peace. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Divine Mother, 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 my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Divine Mother, 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 my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Engrossed is the bee of my mind on the blue lotus feet of my divine mother. Divine Mother, 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 my divine mother. Let's meditate for a few moments together.
Well, great souls, here we are. And we are the fourth of 5 classes. And tonight we're going to talk about the 2 chakras, I hope to, chakras that we haven't yet discussed, which is the heart chakra and the throat, or 2 of them that we haven't discussed. In earlier classes, I talked about why we're doing basically primarily the 5 chakras, the 5 Pandavas. I won't repeat all of that. What I'm wanting now to describe to you is what the essential positive characteristics are of the heart chakra and how it plays in to both to our spiritual life and into our everyday life. Now what we're doing is we're going earth, water, fire, and last week when I was talking about Arjuna and the decision that has to be made as to whether or not I'm going to use my willpower to remain continually engaged in outward realities, or whether I'm going to use my willpower to gradually transform myself into a higher state of consciousness. In a very real sense, the direction of these two chakras, the third and the fourth chakra, this is the critical point. The critical point of deciding to put out the willpower and really go to war on this issue, and then also the opening up and the cultivating of love. And if we can get the third and the fourth chakra working together with the energy moving upward, then our whole spiritual life is really on a solid ground. So the heart chakra is it represents the air element. And if we think about air is when everything begins to really open out and there's no apparent form. I talked about how water takes on the shape of wherever it is, and fire is tremendously transmuting. You can put almost any kind of form into it, and if you apply enough fire, it will completely transform it and liberate it. So the power of the third chakra, as I was talking last week, in terms of being a warrior, it liberates. It liberates us from fixed ideas. It liberates us from fixed ways of being. It liberates us from self-definitions, because all of it can be thrown into the fire, and with that determined willpower, we can transform everything. One of the realities that we need to understand about the chakras, and I'll talk perhaps a little bit more, maybe tonight, maybe next week, a little more about this. All that we're talking about when we're talking about the chakras is we're talking about energy. We're talking about energy held in a certain pattern because of the quality of our own thoughts, actions, and feelings. And it assumes a power over us, or a defining reality over our everyday experience, over our karma, over our destiny, just the way we experience life, so much so that we begin to think of it as if it were in itself something solid. But it's not. It's just an energy pattern. And it's just an energy pattern that is held there because we have planted sufficient self-definition is actually what I want to say, subconscious and conscious commitment to certain vibrations of reality that holds all this energy in a pattern. But it's nothing but energy, which is to say sufficient energy applied in another direction and the entire thing changes, which is why once we get onto the spiritual path and begin to act in such a way as to interiorize, intensify, and uplift this energy rather than merely just spending it thoughtlessly in whatever attracting fields we happen to be in, the transformation can happen actually really at a stunningly fast rate, especially compared to eternity. Swamiji gave me a piece of advice once, and he said, do this and do this and do this, and everything else will follow in relatively short order. I still have the note, relatively short order. Compared to what, sir? Short compared to what? Compared to how many incarnations to get to this point? How many incarnations are left? A 24-hour day, or eternity in a relatively short period of time. But in fact, once those transformations take place, when we actually reorganize the energy in our chakras, which is what the whole spiritual path is, it stays changed. If it's been transformation rather than suppression, which is a whole different conversation that we'll have presumably before this course is over. So the heart chakra, we've moved up to the air level. We've taken solid matter, it's become molten. We think of water, but it's when solid matter begins to break up, it becomes molten. If you think of volcanoes, friends of ours, Pole Star in Hawaii, got to be blessed by the volcano there, and highways of lava flowed all around them, spared much of their community, not all of it, but the highways of lava, molten lava, and then it solidified into solid earth. So coming up from earth, when energy is applied, it turns molten. We speak of the second chakra as water, but it's also molten. And then the fire just continues to liberate that form. If you were going backwards, you would see it the other way. Just from fire, then it becomes molten, then it cools like this. But we get up to the fire level, and then the form is liberated, and it's liberated to the heart chakra, and we call that air. But air, even though we can't discern it as easily as we can see physical form and as we can see fire, nonetheless, it's still a distinct physical phenomenon. It's measurable, and it's separate. It's not completely free. And this is one of the ways that the heart chakra confuses us, because it's not as easily discernible as the three lower chakras. So often the heart misleads us and gives us a false sense of unity and a false sense of freedom that is not quite true to our actual experience. And the primary quality of the heart is the home of our likes and dislikes. And the heart is actually the home of chitta, the home of feeling, where a fundamental quality of spiritual life lives in the heart. And I mean the quality of love, but what I also mean is the quality of feeling itself. Feeling is the way we feel about things is often quite different than the way we think about them. We can have mental thoughts about things, but the way we actually feel about them in our heart is often the stronger force. And very often, people are operating on one set of ideas and another set of feelings, and their lives get very confused until they can bring those into harmony. And one of the realities of the heart is it is the place where desires dwell and where preferences dwell. Because, see, the heart looks freer, but the heart is also, because of those feelings, where we have our likes and dislikes. And vrittis are the whirlpools of energy. Chakra itself means wheel, because the chakras are whirling fields of energy, moving fields of energy. And vrittis are the little whirlpools of committed energy within the chakras that cause it to appear to be in motion. And those whirling whirlpools of feeling are called vrittis. And those vrittis, those churning vrittis, is what creates a magnetic pull that takes our energy and forces it to support that. And so our energy is not free. We often know in our lives that we set ourselves a certain direction. I've been very amused watching myself and other people. I'll set myself a certain direction, and then somehow one thing after another happens, and my energy starts to go there, but by the time it comes out, it's going far off to the left. I was very spontaneous. Oh, that's a nice word for it. When I first came to Ananda in my 20s, and I was not accustomed to disciplining myself all that much. I guess that would be the way you would say it. I generally was gifted with having a very positive nature and a generous nature and a sort of an enthusiastic, upbeat nature. But I was accustomed to doing what I was always calculating my own advantage. Because my consciousness was not low, my advantage, which was really, I considered my advantage to be what would be the most fun. And so I would often be deflected from a more serious purpose if some other thing came along that looked like it would be fun. And fun to me was helping people and spending time with friends. So it wasn't like I did terrible self-indulgent things. But I remember one particular day, I lived on the other side of the hill at Ananda village, at Ayodhya, and it was like a mile or a mile and a half walk over the hill to what was then the Publications building. For those of you who know the community, it's now Hansa Temple, but then it was the Publications building. It was the main office building there. Rajasi Ridge had not been built or even conceived of at that point. And so I set out at 8 in the morning to walk to work. And by the time I got to work, it was 4 in the afternoon. And I'd been quite busy the whole time. I'd run into this person who needed a little conversation, this one needed a little counseling, they needed a little help in the garden, and then there was something going on at the market, and and just all the way through, everything seemed to make sense as I went along. And I finally arrived at the office, and my friend Seva, who was more of a grown-up than I was at that time, And all she said, she had a lot of influence over me, and she didn't have to use a lot of words to have that influence, positive influence. She had a lot of influence. I walked in at 4, which was usually about the time we had to leave to go back to where we lived to take the mail to Swamiji. I came in at 4, and Seva just looked at me and she said, "Good morning." Like that, just good morning. And of course it was 4 in the afternoon, but I had just showed up to work. Now, that to me was a perfect example of the heart chakra in the way that I'm talking about it now. The heart chakra can get kind of airy. It can kind of lose track of the solid commitment of the earth chakra. My friend Seva was very solid in the earth chakra. It wasn't that she didn't have, a very, very open heart, because she did, but she never lost track of what the intention of the moment was. And I could just love this, and then I would love that, and then I would love this, and I would love that. And there was nothing wrong with any of that, except it was, well, here's the word, it was ungrounded, exactly like that. And it took me a while and a number of events, although that was somewhat of a turning point. At that point, I realized that I was quite good at the air element. I didn't have any problem changing gears. Water and air were working just super well for me. I could just take on new form and change gears at any point and find and love whatever was in front of me. But earth and fire needed a little bit more attention. And see, in telling you this story, I'm explaining to you how this way of thinking about the chakras can be really helpful to us. Because there it is. It's like you would think that my open-hearted enthusiasm would be a virtue, and it is a virtue, but it can also be a detriment if I don't have enough appropriate willpower based on the earth element there. Water and air works fine. Earth and fire need a little more work in me, and that was pretty much who I was at that time. I made a decision that day, actually, that I decided after that whatever I had promised, especially whatever I had promised Seva, because she was my soul sister. We were like Siamese twins for about 10 years. We were always together. She was always helping me and always guiding me. She was, after Swamiji, she was the greatest blessing in my life at Ananda. And she was very good at a lot of things that I wasn't good at. And I made the resolution at that point, without having the chakras to guide me, but still knowing it, that whatever commitment I made to Seva, I would keep. And I would keep it exactly. I wouldn't add a little water. I wouldn't add a little air. I would just keep it exactly. It was sort of a joke. If Seva and I had agreed to go to town because we had to do our laundry and I needed to go to town with Seva, even if Babaji was giving a satsang at the retreat temple, I would still go to town with Seva and do our laundry. If I'd said I would, because I could see that my spiritual life was not going to go anywhere unless in daily life I began to be more solid in these ways of doing things. Now, in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, he says that the definition of yoga, and yoga means union, which is all the disparate forces become one reality. The definition of yoga is the neutralization of the vrittis, of the vortices of feeling. And meaning the likes and dislikes are neutralized in an awareness, in a relationship to the bottom 3 chakras, in an awareness of what it is I'm committed to, what God is actually guiding me to do, and applying my willpower to make that happen. Because otherwise, we're always just being compelled one after the other. But the other side of it, you see, it's absolutely necessary that the heart chakra be activated. It's the planet Venus. It's the planet of refinement. It's the planet of upliftment. And the opening of the heart chakra in this embrace, what the heart chakra begins to give us, because the fire has now broken up the forms, and so now our separateness from other people and from the world and ultimately from God gets burned up by the right use of those lower chakras. And so instead of the world being fragmented into those people I like, these things I don't like, just watch yourself in the course of just a day, like how many preferences we are always operating with. Now, some of them don't make a lot of difference. We don't want to become what the Catholics call over-scrupulosity, where we're just always paranoid about every preference that we had. Swamiji, partly because he was ill a lot when he was a child and he had very restricted diet and various things, he was very particular about what he would eat and what he wouldn't eat, and many things were just, not on his menu at all. And I remember Swami just saying it just like this: I am a picky eater, and that's just the way it is. That there was no, he didn't feel the necessity to break down every barrier. This is just the way that he was. It wasn't important. But in anything that really mattered, and even when it was necessary, I tried, I had a very positive recipe for making beets, and Swamiji had a very negative attitude toward beets. And finally, I wanted him to try this recipe, and to let me make it for him is what I mean. And at first he was not interested, but then he realized, as a yogi, he should not have likes and dislikes, even though he was a picky eater. He would not have likes and dislikes, so he allowed me to make this for him. And in his way, afterwards, Swami said, if I were inclined to eat beets, he said, I would ask you to fix them according to that recipe. He said, but I am a picky eater and I choose not to eat beets. And also, even just by the extremely exaggerated sort of likes and dislikes, in a certain sense, he was also confirming that these likes, we should not be ruled by these likes and dislikes. And as I'm saying, our likes and dislikes are, I like this person, I don't like that one, I like to have my meals at this time, I prefer to have the temperature in my room like this, or I'm female or I'm male, I want to be treated this certain way, I want people to like me, I don't like it when people lie. Everybody has all of these things that strike them, and they're not the same for everyone. Many things that other people can find annoying, I can get along with really easily, but when people offer me an illogical argument, or an argument where the facts are just twisted a little to support their point of view, this to me is quite difficult for me to take. I like certain, preferences like this. But you see, our lives then become a constant back and forth. It's very hard to be even-minded and cheerful when we're always weighing and measuring. What we really want to be doing with the heart is we want to be embracing the whole world, but if we only embrace the whole world, what we would call on a horizontal level. I've talked about the chakras in that way, that, the chakras are meant, the energy is meant to rise up and be guided by the spiritual eye, but it also has a tendency to be pulled out in its own way. And so the heart is very dangerous that way, because once the breakdown of form, this is what I was saying a few minutes ago, begins, and we begin to feel a unity with creation itself, there's an almost irresistible desire to love everyone. But then we get all involved in caring about this one and caring about this one and caring about that one, but the air element is still separate. And if we give our happiness into dependent on how we're still operating with likes and dislikes. Because if we're loving people just as people, if we're loving situations just on those situations and not for God behind it, then we still find ourselves very vulnerable. So that opening feeling of wanting, of knowing that we're not alone, and we want to experience our unity, it's very important that that energy be directed upward to the divine. And when that energy is directed upward to the divine, what happens is, the other thing that happens here is, the fourth chakra is very close. These two chakras are really close, and closely related. And what I was talking about last week is where the third chakra goes, Arjuna. Where Arjuna chooses to go is going to determine how the war comes out, whether the spiritual forces or the materialistic forces work. And if the heart energy goes out too, what's the word I want to use? Too recklessly, in this sort of first awareness of my unity with the world around me, and it goes out too recklessly, without sufficient willpower used in the right way, then all of a sudden all of our energy can get drawn downward, because we become infatuated with this one, we become desirous of that one. And then when those infatuations are not met, then this anger begins to come, and everything is downhill from that point. So we have to be exceedingly conscious of cultivating the right kind of love. Because if the heart's love, now think about this, when we love something, we don't have to work hard to put energy out toward it. Isn't that so? I've never been a parent. I've never had a child of my own. But all the people that I know, and of course in the course of living in community as many years as I have numerous godchildren and many dear friends who've raised children. You don't have to try to think about your new baby. It's not like you have to say, oh my gosh, I have a baby. Like, oh, I forgot, tie a string around my finger so I won't forget that I have a new baby at home. It's impossible not to think about the child. The couple in our community have just become grandparents for the first time, and actually I've thrived on it, on the everyday feed of the next great picture of the greatest grandson ever born. And I have met him, and I think he might really actually be an Academy Award-winning grandson. But the absolute commitment of his grandparents, which I adore, to this really unusually beautiful child, there's no effort involved. I think they simply can't even think of anything else. And so all of the fire of self-discipline, all of the loyalty and the determination and the creativity that those lower three chakras represent, it just automatically sails upward when the heart becomes involved and the heart wants to reach out and become unified with this reality. So the most efficient way to cultivate and to work with the chakras properly is to cultivate the love of the heart upward toward the divine. Now, Swamiji also says some very interesting and very important things about the heart chakra, though, because sometimes people think, oh, well, I will only love God. And Swamiji points out to us that we have to grow by natural stages. And the inclination of the heart to reach out and to unify with people in romantic relationships, in friendship relationships, in service to one another. In other words, to learn how to love. The quality of these chakras is meant to be guided by the divine, but guided by the divine includes what is natural to us also as human beings. And Swami talks about the necessity to cultivate sweetness is the word he uses, to really cultivate sweetness in our human relationships. Because if we don't have the sweetness, if we can't express that sweetness outwardly, it's not necessarily automatic that we're going to be able to express it inwardly. Now there comes a point where vairagya sets in, and there's a deep disinclination to be involved with the world, but almost none of us are there. Now, so Swamiji talks about how we have to, well, he uses the Indian proverb or the Indian suggestion. The man loves the woman for the sake of God within the woman loves the man for the sake of God within the man. In the Ananda community, once there was a guest in the community, and he'd only been there a few days, and he felt very drawn. He was having a very deep experience being in our spiritual family, and he had a very deep connection to Swamiji, even though it was only the first time he'd ever been there. And he said to Swami, with tears in his eyes, he said, I feel more love from you, Kriyananda, and more love from the people, many of the people here in this community, he said, than I do from my own family. He said, how is that possible? You don't even know me. And Swami said, yes, it's true. I mean, we don't know you in all the ways that those who have raised you and have lived with you all these years, who know about you in a personal way. He said, you're right. He said, but when we look at you, we see within you God. We see you as a manifestation of the divine. We see God within you, and God we already love. Now that was just such a perfect way to put it, because that is what he was seeing. It wasn't the likes and dislikes of the heart. You're handsome, you're charming, you have these kinds of talents, we get to have these conversations, we share these personal interests, or anything like that. It's what I see in you is the presence of the divine whom I already love. And so the art of using the heart chakra in the right way is not to close it up and just hold ourselves only for God, or to freeze for fear of getting caught up into likes and dislikes. The tremendous challenge of the spiritual path really is, the challenge is in the heart. Because all of us who find ourselves on the spiritual path are here because we've had a lot of experiences in a lot of lifetimes that have made us think that there has to be an alternative to ordinary life. Just ordinary, outward focused, trying to make it work, getting control of the world around us, living through one lifetime after another lifetime after another. And we're in association with people who are not God-realized masters, who may be very sincere and very good-hearted, but just like us, they have karma. And that karma explodes in certain ways, and promises they've made they can't keep, or everything changes, the karma, a new karma just strikes them. You meet someone in a good decade, and then there's another decade, and it's really different. And everything ends in some form or another. If nothing else, we die. Civilizations rise and fall, governments collapse, and new governments come in. One of my friends who grew up in Chile was just sort of talking to me about how many different regimes she lived under growing up. And one was terrible for this reason, and this one was terrible for that reason, and this one was terrible for that reason. I don't want to exaggerate, but that's how I remember her talking to me. Just, the world she lived in externally, the society was just chaos. Friends from Russia, who have been through many different cycles there, friends from China, where government can have a very deleterious effect on individual life. Nobody can stop these things. And in fact, these are all part of this cosmic drama of the yugas, wherever our soul has chosen to come. We choose it because it's right for us, but sometimes we choose it because it's going to give us the intensely disappointing experiences that are required to cause us to lose our fascination with this world. It's a necessary stage on the spiritual path. Swamiji had such a beautiful way of thinking about human suffering, which I've found exceedingly helpful. When he would see people having a very difficult time, and when do we not see people having a very difficult time, he would think to himself, he said, the present suffering will make their eventual union with God all the sweeter. And so he would just, in relatively short order, he would see them as they were, which is to know themselves as one with God, and that day would come, and then all of this would be a dream. The way I think about it, when I see people going through, really, really difficult things, just, someone merely of my acquaintance, but someone, a shopkeeper that I have dealt with for 20 years. So it's that kind of friendship. It's more than casual, but it's not part of my everyday life. But not only is their business having enormous difficulty because of the pandemic here in 2020, but also now there's a cancer diagnosis in the family. And I was looking at her. There was nothing I could say because, I did say we would pray for them, and that was much appreciated. But I thought to myself, this is the kind of suffering that draws us to God. It's just as simple as that. When suffering of this magnitude happens, it breaks the form. You know, if we've been getting our security from the earth chakra that the form is going to stay, I have my business, I have my family, I have this, that form, it's going to stay like that. Then the water chakra starts moving in and everything starts shifting, and fire comes in one way or another, and all of a sudden the heart is just in a panic. Because where is its security? What's it going to do now? What's going to happen? And so either the heart plunges back downward, so to speak, and we use our willpower to grip even tighter and try to make the forms work and swear it's not going to change and we'll beat this. Or the heart realizes that there's no security in collapsing downward, that even that earth chakra has to be loyalty to God's will. And this is the kind of suffering that drive people to seek God. And it goes right through the heart. And so the great challenge of the heart is not to panic and try to grab a hold of this world and make it be okay, when in every way it isn't. We are living right now in very uncertain times. Nobody has any idea what's going to come next. In the USA, where this is being filmed at the end of September in 2020, we're coming up on a national election. It's just, I'm 73 years old. I've never known such an uncertain time in this country, ever. And many people on the planet, we just have no idea. It's just here we are. But this is the kind of uncertainty that gives us the opportunity to shift our first chakra into true security, which is not to look to form, but to look very strongly to the spiritual eye, to where God dwells. And the heart is the place where that's going to happen. When the heart panics and closes and tries to grab and hold, then all the energy goes down. But the temptation, and this is where I was starting to say a moment ago, the great temptation of the heart, you see, is it gets hurt. I remember at a certain point in my life when I was in a very vulnerable position in my emotional self. And at the time, there was some work going on. I was living at Ananda, where everything in my life, that's where I've been since I was 24. And we had these outdoor picnic tables in the dining area. Outside the dining room area, there were all these picnic tables because the weather was so good. We could often eat outside. But they didn't want the wood to get corrupted by all the food, so they were painting it with this polyurethane paint, which was, just plastic. And so they would put these multiple layers of this plastic substance on top of the wood, so you could still see the wood. It still looked like a wooden table, but the plastic was impervious. And so it protected the vulnerable wood underneath with this clear layer. So anything could happen on the top, but it wouldn't penetrate to the wood. And I saw myself feeling at the time extremely vulnerable, that I was trying to solve the problem by just painting over a little polyurethane on my heart. Because if I didn't, too much would penetrate. But I also began to realize that the more I painted it over like that, also nothing could come out. That I was locking myself in, I was making myself small and I was making myself closed because I didn't want to have to experience what I was having to experience, as simple as that. Many, many, many incarnations, this is the choice we make. It's, the way Swami put it, when karma hits us, it's like a wave. When a wave of karma hits us, it has a certain force and a certain size, if you want to call it like that. The wave is of a certain size. And we are, if we are smaller than the wave of karma, when the karmic wave crashes over us, we feel crushed by it. And what happens a lot of times is the karma is of a certain height, but over time, the height of that karmic wave begins to wane just because other experiences, start happening in your life. The wave may still be as powerful as it was, but it just moves back in time. And so oftentimes we think we've overcome something, but we have never actually grown. We've just hung on until enough time passed that the karmic wave was a little smaller than we were. And then we say, I've gotten over it. But we haven't gotten over it because the next time a wave of that power comes, we haven't grown any. And it's just going to crush us again. And this is the kind of suffering that brings us to God. And the great challenge of life is not to paint over the heart, but to actually accept what life gives us, go through whatever it is, which is often a near-death experience of grief or suffering or loss or disappointment, and then take all of that energy and instead of sinking down and trying to hold on even tighter to all our limited ideas, but allow that energy to go up to the spirit. To cultivate, in other words, in all circumstances, Divine Mother, if you sent this to me, then I want it. I remember once Swamiji was very sick with the flu, and he was so bored, he invited some of us over. I was reading him, I think we were reading The Robe, and that's a novel about Jesus' lifetime. I was reading this novel out loud to him. There was a few of us sitting around, and Shivani came over also, and she walked, Swami's, his dome was just one big room in his bedroom at that time. There wasn't the downstairs apartment and all of that. He just had a loft, that's the word I want to say, but a big loft where he had his bed, and he was just stretched out on the bed with this fever. Shivani comes upstairs and she starts walking right close to Swamiji. She wants to take his hand and greet him. And he said, don't come close to me, Shivani, I have the flu. And Shivani didn't even hesitate. She marched right up to him, took his hands, put her face right close to his and says, if you have it, sir, I want it. Just like that, which was the intuition that had come to me when I first saw Swamiji. Whatever he has, that's what I want. And she was making a joke on that, but also seriously, what you have, I want, which is I want to be open-hearted, courageous, and accepting of what God gives me. That's what Swami was like. He never shrank from the experience. Someone remarked once about a very advanced spiritual teacher who had a huge karmic explosion in his ashram, and actually his own devotees threw him out of his own ashram. It was during the 80s when all the spiritual teachers in America were being persecuted, including us. 80s, 90s, we were all being persecuted, including Ananda. And he ended up, and a friend, very good friend, wonderful man, took him in, and he started over, with those who really recognized his spiritual greatness and weren't caught up in the kerfuffle. And so the man who took him in wrote about it, and he said it was so fascinating to watch someone of that man's spiritual stature have such a seemingly devastating experience in which years of work just sort of evaporated. He said it wasn't so much that man was having a hard time, is that a hard time passed through him. And that's what the heart needs to be. A hard time passes through it. God sends it, a hard time passes through it, a lot of karma gets burned, all my likes and dislikes just get destroyed, everything that I wanted is gone from me, and I'm not making a joke. And it doesn't always come in huge catastrophic ways. Sometimes it just comes in this gradual realization that nothing is really going to turn out the way that I hoped. What I thought was going to happen, my great career, my very happy family, my beautiful home, the riches I was going to achieve, it just doesn't look like it's going to happen. But instead of closing down at that point to say even more, oh, Divine Mother, what do you have in mind for me? And to let all of our likes and dislikes, which are so natural, so natural to us, we don't even think about it. Just let them all turn into, well, Divine Mother, what do you have in store for me today? And then what happens is the natural inclination of the heart begins to refine, because the farther we move up the chakras and the closer we become to the spiritual eye, the more the apparent unity, which is what air creates, and this apparent closeness Actually, even that little bit of separation that is the quality of air in the atmosphere, even that little bit of separation begins to dissolve. You see that? It begins to dissolve because everything becomes, Divine Mother, what do you want from me? Why are you sending this to me? I often joke that you can use the same words in two different ways. You can say, God, why are you doing this to me? Or you can say, God, why are you doing this to me? Exactly the same experience. It just depends on which way the heart turns. Does the heart rush out to use its willpower to get its likes and dislikes back? Or does it just surrender them when they're all just going to be taken away? There's an incredible story. There's a man named Viktor Frankl, and he was 24 years old when, I guess he was Austrian, when the Nazis took over Austria. He was Jewish, he was arrested, he was sent to a concentration camp. He was an intellectual, he was a psychiatrist, and his values were intellectual. So, where some people were hiding diamonds and jewels and things that were important to him, he had his manuscript of his book or his dissertation or whatever he was working on. He had his manuscript, and he'd hidden his manuscript inside his coat. And when he was being taken into the camp, they were ripping the linings of all the coats because that's where everybody was hiding their valuables. And they picked up this manuscript, which was who this man was. They just threw it into the trash like that. And he lived through this experience. His wife, his family, they all died, but he lived through it. And he wrote a book called A Search for Meaning, well worth reading. But he talks about that moment. He said, in that moment, when I saw everything that I had worked for up to that point in my life, just completely unvalued and thrown away. Of course, this would be like the 1930s or the early 40s. It wasn't like he had a computer disk somewhere. It's like that manuscript was it. And he just watched it gone. He realized in that moment that he basically was standing at the absolute crossroads, and everything that happened afterward would depend. Would he reach out and try to keep it? Or would he just open his arms and his heart and let it go? And he just made the decision. And from that point, he said, he never clung to anything. And he was years there. And his wife died right away. He didn't know that because he continued to feel her presence and communicate with her from the other side. He didn't know till after the war that she wasn't living, because he was in such constant communication with her. He said he would just talk to her, he would feel her presence with him. She must have just hovered around him until he was out. But from that point, he never reached for anything else again. He just took that energy and lifted it up. Whatever God wants, that's what I want. And afterwards, he became a very, very effective psychiatrist, because that was the model that he began to use. And he called it the search for meaning. And that meaning is we take the heart, we pull the lower three chakras, we pull it upward. And then we rise to this chakra. This chakra is Venus, this is love, and here we have Mercury. And Mercury, this represents what's called the ether element. And Swamiji talks about this. He said the idea of earth, air, fire, water being the essential elements was always a very common idea in traditional ways of understanding the world. He said chemists have taken over the word element. He said, but when they're talking about it, they're talking about different elements of the physical world. All of these, different chemical elements. I'm not schooled enough. I took chemistry in high school after I had already been accepted at college. So all I had to do was pass in order to be able to still go to college. So I really learned nothing. In fact, I was virtually a 4.0 student. I might well have been. I think I made a D in chemistry. It was really, really a low grade. And maybe it was, anyway, somehow I balanced. But the principal thought it was an error. They just couldn't believe I actually had a grade like that. But I was already accepted, and all I had to do was graduate. So I know nothing. What I just said is more than I know. But Swami talked about, what people call chemical elements is only about the earth. It's not about the cosmos. And ether used to be a philosophical concept. And Swami tried to explain it, and Swami himself said he doesn't quite understand it, but Master talked about there's a vibration that's called space. And space is an illusion, but it's a vibratory force field. And ether is what holds it, what makes space what it is. Now, that doesn't make any sense at all. But what I'm trying to say is, we're one step more subtle than air. And by the time we get to the fifth chakra here, this is Yudhisthira. He was the eldest, he was the wisest, he was the son of Dharma, he was powerful, he was pure, he was everything good. That's what this throat this represents. And it represents, as Swami describes it, just absolute calmness. And then Swami also makes this important distinction between calmness and peace. When we talk about the 8 manifestations of God, which is another wonderful, interesting subject, peace is one of the 8 manifestations, and calmness is a separate one. As Swami puts it, peace is somewhat passive. Peace descends upon us, all conflict is resolved. Peace is profound. All conflict is resolved. Everything has come to unity. But the nature of peace is just that. There's nothing that ripples. Calmness is dynamic by contrast, because calmness is something that we can, especially speaking now about taking these qualities of the chakras into everyday life. Life is often not at all peaceful. Often life is a huge struggle. And this is again where Arjuna comes in. We have to use this fiery willpower. And many people on the spiritual path, especially when we first begin, well, let me just phrase it differently. Sometimes people imagine that what the spiritual path is going to give them a pass, give them a free ride around a lot of things that they don't want to have to work out. It's been very interesting over many years of living in community and living at Ananda. I've watched this happen. I've watched people come in with usually some complex psychological issue. It could be, some trauma that has happened to them, some lifelong habit of suppressed energy, some fear of having basically been so hurt in the heart that I'm just going to turn my back on the world and go to God. But there's a conflict there, and that we're hoping that we're just going to be able to skip all of this battle. We're not really going to have to fight our way through this. We're just going to go right to the calmness like this. But I've never seen it work. I've never seen it work. It works out because if a person is really sincere and really deep on the path, what happens is the energy, genuine energy moving up with the spine toward the spiritual eye, pulls those vrittis out of the chakras. Maybe tonight, and if not tonight, then definitely next week in the last class, I'll put some pictures on the board to really explain how that works, because it's exceedingly important. Sooner or later, it has to be resolved. So we have to understand that the fifth chakra, Yudhisthira's power, is not the power of passivity. It's not the power of just resting, because he also was a great warrior, and he did battle with the forces of materiality, and he was the king, and he was the leader, and all of the Pandavas looked to him to define Dharma and to define what they had to do. And he had tremendous power. He had all the chakras were working with him, all his brothers were working with him, and Arjuna was working with him. But calmness, it starts in the heart. What do you want from me, God? Everything that comes to me is God's will. And there has to, in order to have the calmness at the fifth chakra, there has to be fearlessness in the heart. Because if the heart is afraid of being hurt, of being disappointed, and believe me, all of us are like this. This is why we have to have Arjuna in the fight with us. This is why we have to constantly use the fire to burn up all of these preferences. This is the battle. When I met Swamiji, when I got to know Swamiji, I so enjoyed the power and the clarity of his mind. That is sort of like, he and I would even joke about it a little bit, like intelligence is kind of a hobby of mine. It's not necessary to have, this kind of verbal capacity, but it's my hobby. And I enjoy it. I enjoy this kind of conversation. I enjoy people who can engage on that level. It's just, if Swamiji had been Mon, if he had been in silence his whole life, I still would have gone and followed him, because the relationship was formed before he spoke. But after he spoke, that first time I heard him, I don't remember anything he said, but I do remember saying to myself, well, my intuition said to me, this is the most intelligent man I've ever met, which was like, oh, thank you, God. This will be even more fun. And it was great fun. But there was just something about the quality and the penetrating clarity of his intelligence that was so beyond anything that I or any of us could reach. Of course, it moved past intelligence into wisdom. But it also just manifested as this calm clarity in his mind. And I gradually came to realize that the clarity of his mind was because of the courage of his heart. And the lack of clarity in my mind, which was notable, I was active, but I was not always clear, was always because my heart was rushing around with all its likes and dislikes. And your heart becomes pre-committed. You don't know it's committed. The vritti has been sucking your life force for so many incarnations. You just think this is the way you were made. You don't realize it's a vritti sucking your life force, trying to protect you from having to deal with some limitation, disappointment, desire, whatever it might be. It's just the way you lean all the time. That's what I was saying. I watch myself and I see others. They start out with a certain intention and then they end up over here. Just like when I was trying to get to work. I started out at 8 o'clock, I got there at 4 because I kept getting diverted. And so our vrittis take our life force and just take it somewhere. And Master said, reason always follows feeling. If the heart is prejudiced and wants a certain result, the mind will find a way to support the heart. And of course, they both have to be in balance, but if feeling will dominate reason. That's how Master put it. So the reason Swamiji's mind was so calm and clear was because he wasn't afraid. He just wasn't afraid. I was talking earlier about not covering over so that we can protect ourselves from being hurt again, but just opening ourselves up to, what have I got to lose? If I have to learn this, I have to learn this. My 1 year of college, which I referenced, whatever I was 18 and I lived in this women's dorm, and I made the decision, probably falsely, that 18-year-old women were the most unhappy group of people I'd ever known. And I just sort of watched how at that particular time, this would have been 1965. People are people, but there was a lot more focus on finding your husband, at least finding your boyfriend if you weren't going to find your husband, and a tremendous desire, which is just human nature, needing to be loved. And I would just see people were so afraid, just so afraid of loving. And I would always say, what have you got to lose? I don't know where. I was as cowardly as anyone, but not quite as cowardly as some of them. What have you got to lose? You never go wrong by opening your heart. If you love someone and it doesn't turn out to be, they don't respond in the way that you hoped, you've given something beautiful into the world. What is there to be afraid of? I had a little glimmer of it. I didn't realize how much I had to learn, but I had a little glimmer of it, and I knew it was there. Swami was just like that. I choose to love. That's how he would put it. He had many people in his life who betrayed him, who vehemently worked against him for his whole life. But he always referred to such people as his self-styled opponents, his self-defined detractors. He would never just call them his detractors or his opponents. He would always say self-defined. And then he would say, I choose to love. Why lose twice? He said, what difference does it make how people respond to me? He said, I may have to change my behavior, but I don't have to change my heart. And I began to understand that it was this absolute fearlessness of his heart which led to a profound calmness. Because where does agitation comes from? It comes from the fear that this isn't going to happen and the desire that this is going to happen. I mean, just think about it. We lie awake at night, we worry, what about this, what about this? We're not calmly able to walk into a contentious situation, just feeling that God is with us, and what difference does it make? Whatever God wants to have happen here. That calmness has to come when the heart is unafraid. So they treat me badly, so they insult me, so they don't give me what I want, so they cheat me out of what is rightfully mine. If I am calm, which is what the throat chakra represents, then I can feel the presence of God and I can rightly discern what the appropriate response is. If the heart is panicked, then we do the oddest things. We do very odd things. I learned the panic of my heart by listening to the sound of my voice. Because my heart would panic before my mind realized that I was panicking. But it would always come out in the sound of my voice. And my words would come out faster and faster, and then we get a little bit louder like this, and then it would get into a higher and higher register. And I learned that when any of those things were happening, I needed to stop. Just stop, regardless of how convinced I was that what I was saying needed to be said. It did not need to be said, because we were careening out of control. And Swami, this is the chakra also of the voice. And Swami talks a great deal about sound and about the voice, and how he talks about how the voice immediately reflects nuances of consciousness. My friend Seva, that I referred to for many years, we worked in the same place, and every morning we both lived in little trailers, and we lived just right next door to each other. And I would go over to her house, and then we would walk together over to across the hill and over to the publications building where we worked. And she was inclined in those days. She sometimes got sad. She had an inclination to become a little bit sad, and it was so interesting. As soon as she said a word to me, I could tell immediately what her mood was, because as soon as her mood shifted, there was a tone in her voice, and I could just hear it. And voice print is a surefire way of identifying. It can be used to be a security system, because the voice print is your consciousness. So Swamiji also talks about learning how to express ourselves, not just in words, but drawing the feelings of the heart, and in fact, drawing all the 4 chakras below the throat chakra to create the vibration. He talks about how we can work it from both sides. On one side, we can listen to our own voice. I remember when I was just beginning to speak publicly like this, and I gave a Sunday service at Ananda Village in some way or another, and it wasn't very good. And one of my friends just sort of said to me, it was actually a very sensitive suggestion. She said, "Why don't you just listen to a recording of that talk?" And it was really interesting to me, because I listened to about 3 minutes of that recording, and her voice, which was my voice, was so hard to listen to. And it wasn't just me criticizing me, it was just really hard to listen to. There were too many wrong attitudes that were being reflected, and I was clever with my words. I've always been clever with words. But the agitation of my heart colored the sound of my words, and I thought, good heavens, no one would want to listen to that. And it was right. And it really instructed me, and from that point I made a specific effort not to speak with that inner attitude which caused the sound of that voice. So Swamiji talks about is listen to the sound of our own voices. Pay attention. Swamiji gave advice to one man that he wanted to help him develop a certain consciousness that he thought would help him. He told him to speak in a lower register. his voice was somewhat high-pitched for a man. He said, speak in a lower register. Deliberately lower your voice. Bring in more of the earth element, or bring in more energy of the fire element, or because a voice can be kind of undefined. You can just kind of be a watery voice, and not a lot of consonants in it, and there's just not a lot of commitment in it. Just go like this. All the different ways. Or we can always speak with so much force. Who wants to listen to that either? All of those things start manifesting from here, from this chakra. Swami just talks about how we gather all the energy, all the positive energy of all the chakras, and then bring that out and make that who we are. But the calmness of this also wrongly expressed, Swami says. You see, we can mistake. Calmness is very dynamic. Calmness is fearless. Calmness is what a soldier has on the field of battle when he does heroic things that afterwards he doesn't even know how or why he did them. But, the whole battlefield just goes away and he just sees the objective and just goes toward it and takes his whole battalion or his whole cohort with him. And they do remarkable, courageous things, and it's never crossed the mind of the hero, even to be frightened. He's just moving through. In these days where we have such a worship, such an admiration for sports heroes, many of the best athletes who have really honed their skill into something really remarkable will often talk, I think the phrase they use is the zone, that they'll be in the stadium or the field or the court or whatever it is with thousands of people screaming and all the other opponents doing what they're doing, and he doesn't see any of it, or she doesn't see any of it. They're just absolutely calm, but they're moving and they're reacting and they're just on a hair trigger like this. There's nothing passive about it. It's very, very, very dynamic. And that's what real calmness is. Calmness is fearless. Now the negative side of it that people get into is they actually become apathetic. But it's in the name of being detached. But if one is actually apathetic or pretending a certain detachment. Swami made a comment once about one person. He says, they appear to be detached, but what they really are is uncommitted, was the phrase Swami used. So we can sort of have developed, we feel like we've developed the fifth chakra quality of calmness, but we don't have the fire behind it. And the heart is also usually very protected. And so rather than risk opening myself and being committed, and this is where Swami says, we can't just withdraw the love from the world. We have to actually be able to give all that love to the world because we're giving it to God in the world. We can't just hold it back in the name of, well, I'm just going to love God, or I don't want to be attached. I remember this woman had just gotten married and her husband was away for a couple of weeks and she was very much missing him, and a friend came with what we call true but irrelevant spiritual advice. And she was sort of lamenting his absence. And he said, now don't get attached. And she, being rather a feisty sort, just answered back, do you think I would have married him if I wasn't attached to him? Like, what a ridiculous suggestion. I'm totally committed to this relationship. And the man who was giving the true but irrelevant advice had a false kind of calmness, a false kind of detachment. It was the detachment based on always being protected. Protection is not freedom. Fear is not freedom. See, the vrittis don't lie, the chakras don't lie. We can put on a front for everything else, but whatever the actual vibration of the thought, the feeling, or the action is, that's what registers in the chakras. And that vibration becomes the magnetism that we're putting out. And that's why I was saying, even if people are trying to do an end run around certain things they don't want to face, it will never work, because this is a magnetic interplay of forces. And sooner or later, even if we're hoping that we're going to call ourselves, calm when we're really uncommitted, that sooner or later something will happen. and the conflict between that will just blow up. So we can't pretend to have that kind of calmness. It has to come from my security is with God. See, what makes us not calm? Our concern about what's going to happen. What will happen if? And a lot of times, if does happen. It's just the way the world is. We can't guarantee. I had an interest for many years of my life, which fortunately recently, meaning the last 5 or 6 years, has waned. But I would read lots of true stories of people who had to face very, very difficult circumstances. And I don't know what I was working through. I really can't even say. But it helped me to really understand that even when catastrophic things happen, people just keep finding a way. I was hearing this woman talk who she was from the Mideast, and I think it was perhaps Iraq or Iran, when she was a child, and she was talking about the wars, various wars that were going on in her country. I don't have the details straight. But she talked about, even then, people had to fix food. Children still went to school. Shops still opened. Life goes on. People have to find a way to go on. One of these stories, which actually it was an amazing story. It was from Cambodia. And these people were middle-class people. I think the father of the family might even have been a physician. He was some professional. He'd worked very hard. He'd bought houses for his 2 children. They were very successful like this, but whatever the invading army was at that point, the army came in. Yes, they came in the front door of the house. They drove the family out the back door. And that was that. And they were just, the whole neighborhood, because whatever the army was, they just wanted the property. They came in, they drove everyone out the back door, then they herded them on the street, and then they just started driving them down the road. And eventually they actually tried to push them all the way out of the country, is what happened. They got all the way to some border. It was quite a story. But the most amazing part of it, from my point of view, among other things, was just how they just figured out how they were going to deal with it. They had to figure out how to eat, they had to figure out how to sleep, they had to figure out what to do next. And eventually, of course, they made their way all the way to the United States and were writing a book about this incredible experience. And now, those are pretty horrific conditions, and God willing, none of us will ever face anything nearly that horrific. But the extent to which our happiness and our ability to remain calm depends on any outward condition, we're vulnerable. And even if we don't even have a conscious thought about it, some part of us knows. And also, we're not talking now about just getting through. We're talking about God realization. We're talking about, really understanding how we can fulfill what Jesus says, be therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect, because that's who we're meant to be. And all of it finally comes down to this, and once the heart is unafraid and the fire chakra is there constantly, burning up any inclination to sink downward, but it stands, the fire chakra stands as a barrier. It keeps the heart from panicking because the heart panics and wants to go downward and grab on what used to be or what I want or whatever it might be. And the discipline of the heart, the fire chakra, is just right there. You're at war with yourself. And there's often a strong war that goes on. The heart wants to be jealous, the heart wants to be angry, the heart wants revenge, the heart wants to drink, whatever it might want to do, drink some beverage that will cause me to forget, whatever it might be. And it starts heading for that kind of security, and it meets the fire. And the fire says, no, actually, we're not going to do this. And if we can get these two forces working, both of them really working, then everything will automatically rise to the throat, and then automatically from the throat, the energy, that calmness, because the only way the heart and the throat chakra can really hold is that if it's a constant upward-looking reality. If we're always looking not, and then we come to this chakra here, which is the medulla and the spiritual eye. This is our individuality. This is the jiva having its destiny. And so the question, this is the same chakra. This is our self-definition. Am I a limited physical being, separate from everything else in the world, maybe with a few spiritual ideas, but basically here to take care of myself, which is what the ego says? Or am I really one with the infinite, loved by God, and that the more I can cooperate with that reality, the more powerful I'll be? I love the relationship, the proximity of the medulla and the spiritual eye in this sense. Because of the ego self is centered here at the medulla, and most of us are identified with our egos, is one of the reasons we identify more with our eyes than any of our other senses. It's because this is the way I think about it. I don't even know if this is metaphysically sound, but this is how I think about it. I think about myself just kind of sitting in a comfortable chair right here at the medulla, just sitting in a comfortable chair. And I'm looking out through my eyes, but I'm looking upward through my eyes at the spiritual eye. And so where is my gaze? There's this spiritual principle that Swami talks about. Downward is towards subconsciousness. Level is simply the conscious mind. Slightly raised is moving towards superconsciousness. And looking downward also from the medulla, we're looking down the chakras. We're thinking about, going down the chakras. Level is just using the mind and using the cleverness of who I am to figure this out. And when we talk about subconscious, we're not just talking about sleep. I joke because as a public speaker, I've watched more adults fall asleep than most adults get to watch. Fortunately, I can usually crack a joke or something and wake them up, but people would come to night classes after a long day of work, poor dears, and they would be very sincere, but I get to watch them fall asleep. And so I know that people's eyes drop when they fall asleep because I see it happen. But subconscious is also to be influenced by the inclination to cling to what I already know. Because the subconscious stores everything that we've been, all our past lives, all our past habits, and it's just pulling us. It wants us not to change. It wants things to stay just as they are. This is a misunderstanding of the earth element and insufficient of the water element. I just want it to stay. So I'm sitting in my comfortable chair, resting on my medulla, and I'm looking. And do I look downward, which is to say toward the past, and just try to hold everything as I've always known it to be, cling to my self-definitions, and let me see how many of them I can keep? Richard Bach, who was a very wonderfully inspired writer who wrote very popular books in the 70s and the 80s, presumably he's still somewhere doing good work. He said, if you fight to keep your delusions, the prize is you get to keep them. So it's like, that's what we're here. And I just look downward and I want to stay as I am, and the prize is I get to. At least I get to keep trying. Or I just look straight forward and I keep analyzing and I keep trying to think about, what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. And the medulla is the point where the energy comes in, and it sends the energy through the chakras, and I just instruct all my chakras either to cling to the past or just to keep the system running in relationship to all of this, or I look up and I offer my energy into the spiritual eye, and I ask the simple question, God, what do you want me to do? And then from there, the ego self begins to cooperate with the divine self, and all of the chakras begin to run in relationship to the spiritual eye, in relationship to our understanding of ourself as a child of God, ever loved by Divine Mother. That's what this is all about. Who's running the show? And it's always going to be me, the jiva, individually, but who am I? What am I? What is real? This is what we talked about in the first class. How do I define myself? Who do I aspire to be? Am I perfectly happy? Can I imagine a greater reality than the one that I know? And that's when the fire chakra, this is the kind of suffering in this life or in lives before it. This is the kind of suffering that stiffens my spine and lights my fire and burns through the limitations of the heart to come to this calm acceptance of God's will, so that the ego, the sense of self, can shift from the ego to the divine. Okay, my friends. God bless you. Thank you for sharing this time with me.